Welcome back to another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed. I'm a corporate and M&A lawyer that works with SaaS founders to help them with their SaaS contracts, raising money. And I'm also an M&A lawyer. So when SaaS founders want to sell their businesses, I help facilitate the sale of their business, the acquisition contracts and negotiations and those sorts of things. And the reason why I launched SaaS Buyers Club, the mission of SaaS Buyers Club, is we're here to give SaaS founders as much value as possible so that they can get the best exit possible. And I believe that anyone that can come and share value with SaaS founders that gives them any sort of information or insight into building their SaaS companies or making their SaaS companies more valuable helps them get a better exit. And so with that being said, I am pleased to welcome Iris Who. Iris Who?
That's right.
Awesome. Iris, what was your title at Salesforce?
I was the VP of M&A Finance, which I did for about 10 years. When I left, I was supporting our top 1,000 customers and customer success. But I'd spent the majority of my life and career at Salesforce, spanning across 18 years of my journey. And yeah, it was one of the most remarkable places I've ever worked in my life.
So I'll tell everyone out there, the reason why I thought that Iris would be a great guest for this show is she basically built a playbook for Salesforce to acquire businesses. And she had so many insights when we spoke about what it was like for Salesforce to acquire companies. And I think that there's a lot of value that Iris can share for SaaS founders to understand what to expect when they get acquired by, for example, a large company like Salesforce. But also, I just find the entire process and all the stories fascinating. So I'm really pleased to have you here as a guest, Iris.
Well, thank you, Omeed. I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity to share a little bit about what I've learned, a little bit about my journey, and also share the pains and struggles that people have. And hopefully this will help people build out the necessary skill sets, capabilities, as well as do it in a way that I think we all want to live, which is with some level of kindness and empathy, because it is a slog. It is hard. And I think if we can do this well, many people benefit by the leadership and the vision. So thank you.
Absolutely. So 18 years at Salesforce, how many acquisitions?
I lost count at some point, but about 40 and big acquisitions, small acquisitions, tuck-ins. But I started in my journey around 2010 when I was leading operations, and I got pulled out to do M&A because I knew the underlying processes across order to cash. And it was such a great opportunity for me to learn. And also it was such a great stretch opportunity. So taking what I'd learned and trying to apply it to this amazing new thing was like solving, a dark puzzle, like trying to figure out the pieces and how that would fit into an organization. And I learned that on the fly. I didn't, there was no playbook. There was no structure really, and very little direction at the time. And I think that's pretty prevalent in companies who are starting to acquire. And because they don't have an IMO department, they don't have a huge biz dev department. They have people who know their business and they believe it's a strategy they want to go with now, and they go after it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what I'm doing right now in my consultancy is helping people build the requisite things so that they can be successful.
So let's talk about some of those things.
You bet. I think as a small company, or as you're starting to entertain the idea that buying something becomes part of your strategy, people naturally go to lawyers or investment banks or deal makers to look at what they should buy, how they should model their deals, what would be both accretive as well as meaningful for their organization. But the one shortcoming that they don't do is start to do the internal diligence. And what I mean by that primarily is, do they have a vision internally around what it means to their organization? Have they had real conversations with their leadership team? And I'll give you the example. If you're the CEO and you want to go and acquire, are you having conversations with your CMO and saying, hey, if we buy something, what's your thoughts about where we go next with branding? Or do you have people on your team that's going to be able to absorb, a new product? What's your timeline? Same with the CRO. Are you prepared to co-sell? Do you know that you would be assuming new quota in the middle of the year? Are you ready to do that? And if so, how fast and how prepared are you? And having that conversation starts to create a unified strategy across your organization. And then you can basically stress test how much interest, how much participation are you going to have across your leadership team? Because I'll tell you, when we did our first couple of acquisitions, people were busy doing their own thing, managing their own line of business. They were not prepared to take on a new acquisition and this gets dropped on their desk. And a lot of them said, this is not my priority. You set my goals. I'm not changing. Good luck. And that's a very, very hard place to be when you're an acquired company. Now, what do I do? Where do I go? Who do I talk to? And where do I sit? And where do I fall into this bigger, board of things? And so if there isn't a readiness inside your leadership team, that's going to be impossible, if not super hard for everybody else. Internal diligence, I would say, is something you need to do. Get a baseline, have alignment around what that means, and work to devise a true change strategy. Because you have to work in orchestration across the teams to be successful.
All right. So step one for any business that's looking to acquire is start internally and create what you call a change process. Is that right?
Correct. And a game plan of your strategy. Smart leaders know they can change their minds according to whatever's happening, macro conditions, internal conditions. That's not the issue. The issue is being consistent around a framework that everyone then knows what they need to do and not second guess what is happening. And when you have second guessing and people don't know and the clock is ticking, you've just tanked productivity. So having a baseline of that framework, getting that understood and communicated is really step one.
Got it. And when you were at Salesforce, it sounds like you all didn't have an internal change process.
We did
initially.
not.
Yeah.
We did not.
So what did that process of learning or understanding that you needed to have an internal change process, what did that look like?
Well, I'll give you a really simple example. On smaller companies, of course, we were going to have them absorbed into our, offices at a very small step. You don't need a separate office unless there's a reason. And so from a finance perspective, because I worked in the finance department for the CFO, we're going to shut that place down. I'm going to move your vendors, we're going to turn off the lights, we're going to move your stack. Well, if you're not coordinated across the other teams and the product team and the acquiring entity, it could lead to very interesting challenges. Like you haven't moved everybody and all of a sudden the lights go down. Well, that's what exactly happened to us at one point. I had to run around, grab a check, send it to PG&E to make sure that they kept the lights on so that the engineering department still was able to work, because we had not been able to formally decide and determine when they're going to move over. So little things like that is just an example. Not fun. When someone calls you and like, they just told me my electricity is going to go off in the next hour. And you're running around trying to figure out how to solve for this. So that is just a small example of things that could happen. Never mind the bigger issues of being accretive, recognizing revenue, making sure the customers that you've just inherited continue to be happy, excited about joining. Those are the bigger macro issues. And if you're not coordinated on the small things, you can't imagine what, you're doing for the bigger matters.
So once you started to implement this playbook, what did that look like when you acquired businesses and you implement the first step of the playbook, at least in terms of having an internal change process?
It's a multifaceted playbook. People think it's a list of tactics, do this, do that. And you can find 1,000 of them on the internet because they all exist, but they have no meaning unless you have an aligned strategy and you have an aligned timeline. So if the general strategy is that you're going to deprecate everything that was the prior business and absorb everything, then that needs to be coordinated. Every department at Salesforce had eventually their own M&A lead. And so we have to congregate and make decisions together. That's one facet of the playbook. The second one is the macro needs according to the deal model. We're going to absorb X, Y, and Z. These are the people. This is the product. How do you coordinate that across the groups? That becomes a bigger set of change. And then, of course, most importantly, the customers. How do you impact the customers across the board? Do you keep the product live? Do you, people who buy these smaller products, they love their products. They don't want it to go away because they got acquired. So how do you make sure you're touching them, having conversations, making sure you're keeping the right things and bringing those important customers along that journey with you? Because at some point there will be change. You want to be able to ascertain what changes are going to keep them as customers and what's going to really piss them off. And I think after that, you start to cultivate more of a program around what you do and how you do that. Every time you acquire a new company, you need to go back and stress test that model and that strategy. Let go of the payroll department. Are we still going to do X, Y, and Z? And if all those checks, yes or no, then it redefines your tactics for integration. I think some companies just have that standard where this is exactly what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. I think in the world that we live today, that doesn't work as well, because much of the work, much of the intrinsic value comes from the people that work there, and you want to retain that. And so I think one of the things that I was most proud of at Salesforce is the premium we put on people and how we made sure that we tried to retain the talent that we had. And for those departments that, couldn't absorb everybody, how do we create a program or advocate for them to be hired if there was open roles in their departments? When I say that, this is what it really means. I know someone is not going to have a job in payroll, but they want to do AP. Is there a job opening? Can I introduce you to the hiring managers? Can I introduce you to others? Get your leadership to advocate for putting them in the queue or getting them hired, or at least getting them visible. And so that they know this is not just a check box, delete. This is really about a human connection. Part of the building of the program was you cannot over invest in communication and people. And so the more you do in that realm, the better you are at helping people help you be successful.
So what did that look like?
Everybody knows the standard process, right? You go from announcement to some period between announce and close, and interim state to steady state, integration steady state. It's really important between announce and close, at least in finance, to have people on the other side support you through that close process. You don't know their systems. You don't know exactly how they got their numbers. You're now digging into the second layer that you didn't get to through diligence. And you're going to find things. You always do. But you need to be able to build that relationship and have them work with you, because most likely half of them will not be there after close or after some interim state. So how do you do that? Well, you have to participate. You have to actively listen. You have to walk in there with a sense of humility, you are the acquirer, but that doesn't mean you know everything. And it doesn't mean you get to treat people differently or poorly because of it. And the more you work on building that relationship, the more people are willing to help at least get you to the next milestone.
So as VP of M&A, did you only oversee finance or did you oversee integration of acquisitions across different of the roles? So like marketing, finance, operations, engineering, so on and so forth. Talk to me a little bit about what that looked like.
Well, the beauty part about living in finance was that you had to touch every department because you basically help support and build and translate the budget. So we were tactically involved pre-diligence, diligence, all the way through. So internally in finance, I was involved in building both the transition of every deal, as well as advocating where we had holes. So how do you advocate in the next round of hires? Hey, I actually need a dedicated tax person because this is getting unwieldy. And we're going to drop something that's going to put us in a lot of trouble if we don't have a dedicated person doing this. That, was something I did actively in the organization because I wanted to have consistent partners in crime. It's hard to bring up somebody inside of a deal. They don't know what they're doing. They had their day job. And now you're like, okay, what are you going to do about X? They might not know. That's a twofold. And then for the rest of our work, we did have to participate actively with how product, marketing, sales, etc., was going to work together. If everybody said, okay, we're going to flip that thing in 90 days and we're going to be selling that product, we're going to be inheriting that quota, we're going to move that product, that all had to be coordinated and it had budget implications. You had to be actively involved. If we were doing our job right, we would stress test, well, I haven't seen you do that in 90 days. Or are you sure you want to inherit that quota because now this is what your world will look like? And helping them quickly model a lot of those trade-offs was part of our jobs, a part of my job. And also in a small company, having to go to a big company, you're also teaching that leadership team how things work.
Say more about that.
I'll give you, an example around transitioning budgets. You were a company of 100 people, and now most of your team is going to be retained mostly through product because that's what we purchased, the acquisition for. Well, now you're a leader in product, but you're not the CEO anymore, and you're sure not the CFO. And so you have to now transition, at least at Salesforce, to our process and policies. That means something as simple as signatory rights. You can't sign checks anymore. You can't sign contracts anymore. And that can be a hard transition for a lot of CEOs who used to own their own domain. So how do you transition that? How do you do that strategically, timely? And then how do you do that supports the business? If you're helping them transition over, you also have to help them transition how we operate, how we do work, and negotiate. Okay, well, you have this policy. I'll let you sign things for another 15 days or another 30 days. But after that, you no longer have these signatory rights. That's just one example. And that means you have to actively communicate. You have to tell them the why around why that happens and why it needs to happen. And then you have to be the interpreter between the acquired company and the acquiree because you have to do the translation between two groups of people.
And was your department responsible for that communication between the two groups of people, or what did that process look like?
Absolutely. We were primarily responsible for how the finance and ops world would look like, both directly to their finance and ops team, as well as the rest of the organization.
Right.
We didn't become active participants as we're talking about more cross-functional company items, like when are we going to absorb this product and move them to our stack? Or when are we going to start co-selling on the same paper? You should know what that means, right? The contract, you can't have two different contracts and have two different terms. The customer's going to wonder what's happening, and then everybody else has to pick up the pieces to sort that out later. That doesn't work very well. People go into these deals with a lot of assumptions of what should happen. And when you're starting to translate the deal model into the integration budget, that's a lot of work. And then, now that you've crossed one threshold, different opinions all come to the table because now more people are involved. And it could cause a lot of consternation if you, from an acquirer perspective, you don't have a perspective, if you don't have a framework that you work in. But then you also have to cultivate forums by which you're having greater conversations that serve both the deal model needs as well as what you want to happen in the future.
So you just mentioned a framework for these conversations to happen. I'm sure the first acquisition at Salesforce was substantially different than the 40th acquisition at Salesforce.
Right.
But I'm curious, at its height, at its most built out, what was that framework that Salesforce utilized for the integration of the companies that they acquired?
We had set up, from the timeline perspective, when we wanted to have certain conversation and when they needed to be done, meaning both the IMO and the people we worked with on their finance side had a better understanding of what that meant and when it needed to happen. So, for example, the first close that you do, it's, depending on when you actually formally close the deal, a lot of other people in the world want it closed ASAP. From a finance perspective, you're like, well, that's 2 days before our actual finance close. That's going to put hardship on our teams. So we would negotiate that that's not a great timing. Sometimes it works for us and sometimes it doesn't, depending on the size of deal. But, that wasn't always in our domain in our decision, but we offer our opinion on the matter. Now, what does that look like? You get out of diligence and you start to do a prepared plan for integration. Everybody walks up and gives their spiel on, okay, when I want these things to happen, why I want it to happen, and then you coalesce all those opinions and figure out if that timeline works for everybody. And you have to meet often and you have to negotiate often. You have to always advocate and re-educate people about your position, because they're not going to remember everything that you know, and people change. And sometimes you get new players and they need to learn. So one of the things that we did do at Salesforce internally was, when we did have a new person, they would go around to every one of the finance leads or every one of the M&A leads and learn about, their top 10 things that they do, why it's important, and how they do things. So they get a better understanding of how this thing's going to roll. And, certain people and certain groups take priority than others. When you're a public company, there are certain rules you just, you do have to close, and you do have to post some earnings, and you do have to do some regulatory items. That's not going to change, and nobody can change those rules. That's what the world you live in.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about the first acquisition? Do you remember the first acquisition that Salesforce did that you worked on? What was that like?
The first meaningful acquisition I worked on was in 2010. It was called Jigsaw. I had been pulled out a few times to do integration and diligence, but they were small companies, and this was the first big company. And I actually personally loved it. I wanted to do more of this. And so I read a bunch of books. I put together this program, and I went to the CFO and I said, please, I want to do this. And I didn't know what was happening behind the scenes. And he's like, yeah, absolutely. Off you go. I didn't know, like a month later, we were buying the biggest company, at the time. And I would say it was one of my biggest learning curves of my life, because I didn't know what I was doing. I'd put stuff on paper, but now I had to activate it. I had to learn grounds up, get my hands dirty. I mean, I packed boxes. I negotiated with different groups. I tried to get ahead of some of the issues that I didn't know about until I knew about it. And then sometimes, a lot of tension is made, and a lot of people get unfurled by the additional work, especially if it's not their day job. And that meant I had to sometimes go and talk to their boss or their boss's boss to say, so-and-so needs to help me because I don't know tax. I need someone to help me with this. That was a lot to learn. It was also a great opportunity to figure out where all the gaps were. Like, what do I actually need to be successful? And that's why I think I've started this view in this consultancy to help customers to understand what do you need to do to fill the biggest gaps so that you don't run into the things that I fell into and literally fell into. They're not astronomical things. They're definitely things you're just not doing every day because you're not acquiring every day. And when you don't have that capability in-house, you can stumble. And it could have impact to your deal model. It could have impact to the people. And when you don't have answers, when the moment you announce, you start to seed dissatisfaction. You start to seed, especially people who didn't know about the deal. They're now worried. What's my job? Do I have a job? And if you don't have these answers and you don't have a timeline and you don't know, it doesn't breed well for people's contentment. And the number one rule I from that deal I learned was never mess up the payroll. If you're going to transition payroll, you better learn to do it right. At minimum bar, you should be paying these people.
And don't play with people's money.
Do not.
Yeah.
And then from there, it's easy to do command and control if that's what you want to do. But the other thing I learned from that deal and forward and where we've applied it is that culture matters. And so when I did ExactTarget, which was one of my biggest acquisitions that I led, culture mattered to these people in Indianapolis. They really loved their world. They're color orange and we were blue. So you really had to spend time understanding what it meant to them and then find your way of putting both of those things together. M&A is like, marriage of blended families. It's basically a marriage of blended families with all their kids and, crap in their house, and you have to put it all together. And if you want to be successful, you have to think about it that way. You have to come in with some level of empathy because people are dealing with that change.
Give me some more examples of these gaps that you mentioned that have to be addressed. For example, one of them that you mentioned, I think, was payroll. It sounds like also you had an experience with payroll in terms of where, that gap maybe wasn't filled and so people didn't get paid, and that's how you
we always paid them. But here's the problem with a lot of perceived benefit that some companies, especially smaller companies had. We had a deal where they were paying or giving all of their employees breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Well, as a small company, they could do that. They didn't have an exposure level that we did. And so there's tax implications to that as a benefit. So you didn't want to have to eat your all three meals and then get pinged as an expense on your paycheck. When you start to negotiate how to move pay, it's not just pay, it's also the benefits behind that. And the perceived value that someone has to what they're getting can be a big deal. I'm an engineer and I eat all my meals at work. And I'm saying, okay, going forward, you're going to have to bring your own food or buy it yourself. It can mean a lot to a lot of people. But I would give you another example of integration assumptions. When you go in, you say, okay, in 90 days, we're going to absorb this company. We're going to be able to co-sell, co-market. We're going to be able to support their customers. The truth is, it always takes longer. And what we've done now is start to build what we call the integration trough. And that means elongating some of those expenses, making sure that the company that's being acquired is being supported, because you may not hit it in 6 months. You may hit it in a year. You don't know. You don't know until you do the next pass and retest your assumptions. And that matters because the more expenses you put on that integration budget, the more impactful that is to the overall deal. And if you're dealing with a company that's 5,000 people strong and a huge customer base, that has real life implications to the deal model. The conservative way to do this is whatever you think was your integration timeline, I pad it with 6 months. It's on paper, people. You can always change it. But at least this now gives people a sense of what the impact can be and have negotiations around that. The other learn or item that we started to really better understand is that some of our executives don't know how to do this. they don't know how to do M&A. And it's not because they're not smart people. It just hasn't been their experience in the past. And so I promoted a simulation with our IMO partners to build something internally, one-day training, so they would learn how to have these trade-off conversations. Money is not, it's finite. There's only so much budget to be given to everybody. So if you're now having conversations and you want marketing to do a huge, or you want to give a spiff to all the salespeople to sell this product, that money's got to come from somewhere. Now, we're the referee, but teaching executives how to have that conversation with this, the other leader of sales is an important discussion, and they need to know how to do that, and they need to do it better because they're serving the greater purpose of the company. And I would tell smaller companies coming in as a CEO, some of the best ones that we had were ones that quickly ingratiated, their new home and made a vocal stance about what it meant to get involved. And that helped build out productivity. And when you're the acquiring company and you see your leader go, yeah, you know what, guys, this is actually good. It's a good place to work. This is where we need to be. This is how we're going to grow our product. This is how we're going to get out into, X billions. When they hear their leader say those things, they're going to be more comforted than some new person they've never met or talked to before. So staying the course, saying those words, giving comfort to people so that they can get back into doing their job and being productive is going to help you be successful in your deal.
So outside of I heard you mention Jigsaw, what are some of the most notable acquisitions you worked on, and what did those processes look like?
I did probably like 14 in 1 year, and then ExactTarget was our biggest one. That was such a fun deal because they were public as well. We had to meet in a separate city, so that was fun. It was one of those places where, because it was so big, our CFO and a lot of the executives had to come to diligence, which is not what they normally do. So my job went from leading diligence to basically coordinating diligence, which was an interesting twist of events. And as we grew, our deals got bigger. So then we did Demandware for $2 billion, and then MuleSoft for another $6 billion, and then Tableau for, I think it was 15, and then Slack. And so each time we did more and bigger, we had to recalibrate our processes, because what was happening is that we had a huge backlog of stuff that we weren't able to integrate as fast. When you buy these big companies, they're not going to go. We were in finance doing a 90-day clip of all back-end systems, not the front side, but the back side. So sourcing, payroll, all that good stuff. So when you elongate integration and you say you can live as your own thing for a year while we figure out what the integration looks like, and you do a bunch of big deals, it's going to stack up. And now you've got to recalibrate how you do work. One of the things that we did in finance is we carved out a few roles and departments that were always the long tail: FP&A, revenue operations, and because they were supportive of the product and the revenue, right? So they're at the front office. And then I had my group, which was focused primarily on M&A and project management and diligence, et cetera. So we had a separate group that incubated these companies until they reached steady state, which is a different model, and allowed them to have a partner in crime at the finance ops level. It allowed us to take time to better understand the business and to translate those metrics into metrics that our executives would know. We bought ExactTarget. It was utilization. We didn't do utilization. So you can't call ARR, we called it ACB, and use utilization. It doesn't, it's apples and oranges. It don't translate. So how do you do that? And then how do you preserve what is essential of the things you acquired into the new world? Again, support redefining your processes, redefining your method accordingly is a constant conversation. But having a backdrop of what your framework is allows you to make sure that people aren't second guessing what your things are. So for example, ExactTarget had an entity in Brazil. It was great. We didn't have an entity in Brazil, but we didn't have a system and a group of people. We had some. And so now it's larger. What do you do with it?
So what'd you do with it?
Well, we kept it. Well, because, normally we would just lay off all the people that worked in these functions because we didn't need them. We had these people and capabilities already in-house, but we knew we needed to support the business. So we kept those people. So you can change your mind and you can change what you do, but you start with the beginning premise.
That makes sense. Have a process and a plan, but make adjustments to the plan and the process as you go along. Also, it sounds like another core value of your integration method was build it for longer than you would like. I heard that you extended your integration process for 6 months. So before starting to actually bring a lot of these products into the Salesforce universe, you gave them, 6 months to kind of live as standalones before starting to bring them in. Is that it? Am I tracking?
Yeah. I don't think it has to be absolute. I think what happens is the things that would integrate and make life easier, you do, and you do as fast as possible. If you're on one HRIS system, then you have access, you have Salesforce email, you have Salesforce calendars, you can now access the Salesforce tools. But product and tech is always going to take longer because of just the natural, case of it. And but how do you support that while you're still doing the integration of others? How do you make sure that what you're transitioning to and the things you integrate, don't cross swords? Does it matter that payroll is integrated? Not really. Does it? Not really. But does it matter if you don't have sales teams aligned to the new product or sales teams knowing how to sell this en masse? Yeah, that matters a lot. And so if you're not prepared to enable and you're not prepared to co-sell, you got to be able to prepare yourselves, at least in the back office, to manage both sides of the house.
Would you say that there were acquisitions that didn't work as intended?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Can we talk about some of those a little bit?
Yeah. I will just say that we acquired a business that used, monetized, and grew using Facebook until one day Facebook decided that they were not going to, chose a different model going forward. But we were already, we already acquired. So now we had to reshape what that deal meant. And that was fun. M&A is more art than it is science. And then throw a whole shit ton of ego on top of it, and it's really hard to be successful at all costs because it's multi-layered between pure science, deal model, product, revenue, customers to, okay, what are you going to be tomorrow? And who are you going to do it with? And are they going to stay with you? Well, they're going through their emotional trough of like, I'm excited. No, I'm not excited anymore, to, okay, I don't really see a future with my, this organization. All those pieces are, boiling in the pot. So my advice is the things that you can manage, control, or help along, you do. And the things that you can't, you then hurry up and make sure you are a formidable partner to all those people that are making those decisions.
So you did about 40 deals. What percentage of the deals would you say were not successful in the sense that, they were integrated, they were profitable endeavors for the company, successful in that way?
I think that's hard to judge. I would say over 70% of them were successful based on what you just outlined. Some of it was done through brute force, for sure. Depending on how you're defining success, if it's just pure revenue, I think many of them have been what revenue, like how much money should I have been? Should I be accretive by percentage of the deal model? Should I, recognize my multiple and be like, oh, look what I got. And I paid 16x and I'm great. I'm happy about it.
Hmm.
That's sort of in the eye of the M&A beholder to some extent.
How would you define it?
I think I defined it in threefold. One, that you created a deal model and integration model budget that really told the truth. Number two, you continue to support the process with the right people. And if you do that, at least what you do net out is at least some set of really good talent that stays on board to help you see the long game. And then last but not least, having as a company a good reputation of what M&A means to the world. Some companies, if I got acquired by, not going to name names, but I got acquired by X, Y, and Z, I'm not going to be happy about it because I know the way they treat people or the way they manage their integration is very different than how I want to be treated. And so you can buy all the products in the world you like, but if you got nobody operating the stuff, it's not going to matter. And so if you can retain those people, keep them interested, give them a career that they want and do more, I think that naturally leads to better outcomes, both revenue and attrition wise.
Yeah. I've heard so many and been a part of so many nightmare stories where, company sells to bigger company, the seller has no idea why the buyer is buying them. In fact, the seller at some point might realize maybe the buyer doesn't even know why they're buying them or, thinks that they may be buying them for one reason, but it ends up being a disaster. I'm curious what you think about this statement before we actually dive into that conversation. Don't you think that most of the M&A world would define an M&A success, like just how you said, like the multiple was realized, the transaction is profitable. I mean, I think profit is really like a significant driver of so many M&A transactions, even where it's like an acqui-hire, for example, or product-based acquisition or whatever it might be. What are your thoughts?
I think, yes, those are the standard stuff. I think M&A has this really interesting way of retelling history. And some of it is good and some of it is just what it is. When we started to acquire components that now make up Marketing Cloud, that, culminated with ExactTarget, that was all acquired functionality and features. We didn't really have a Marketing Cloud per se. And so as we started to realize what we've acquired and the potential, you start to get smarter about it. Like, okay, now what do I do with this? Okay, I'm going to make my real own Marketing Cloud. What do I have and what I don't have? How do I now compete? And I think good leaders iterate when they know better, because you don't know until you know. And when you know, what do you do now? And then now you recast the story, and not a lie, but a story that says, hey, we started with this idea that we wanted to help build out marketing functionality. We went and acquired a bunch of stuff. Now we're putting it together to make a Marketing Cloud, and we're going to do this for these reasons. And then I think that's how you become more successful, because you actually have to change.
Yeah. I hear a lot of, in general, throughout our conversation so far, like how important it is to be nimble and how important it is to be agile and how important it is to be adaptive in the M&A process, to have a plan, to have a process, but not necessarily be like stuck to that process. I think the two kind of biggest takeaways from our conversation so far is the need for agility and adaptation, as well as like the utilization of communication, from end to end and, early, often, as much as possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think when you're small, you've got maybe 3 or 4 products and you've got a simplified process and systems. Some of the basic things people should just be doing is documenting that. No company goes around with a limited budget trying to make room for potential stuff that may or may not happen in the future. They're not going to devise a system or a policy that naturally inherits M&A needs. This is just not what they need. They can do half the time. But if you can, and in places where you can create a little space, that's good practice. The other part is having the ability to overlay your cultures. I think we haven't talked about that a little bit, is really important. And that one isn't dominant over another. It's like a blended family, as I mentioned. You got to figure out what is the best out of both and figure out how to move forward on that. Some companies actually, take the best of whatever and adopt that and move that forward. There's no absolute rights or wrongs in that because it works differently for each type of organization. But don't underestimate how culture can be an impactful and meaningful attribute to being successful.
Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of how Salesforce maybe approached culture in some of their acquisitions? Because culture is like so much of a like nebulous concept. It's made up of a lot of intangibles. And so, but also it exists irrespective of whether you acknowledge it or not. So yeah, like how did Salesforce approach culture in their acquisitions?
That's a great question. And I'll give you an example. Salesforce has a very dominant culture. We have our icons, we got a bunch of furry, they have a bunch of furry animals. They have a lot of things that identify Salesforce as Salesforce. So I'll come back to ExactTarget. They had a very strong culture as well, and their color was orange. And so when we said in the future, we're going to do away with all this orange stuff, people got really upset about it. They didn't like that idea. Like, why can't we make it, mixed, or why can't we have our own stuff? What I would suggest is don't just negate that right off the bat. Understand why it's important to them and figure out how to come up with something that meets in the middle. But culture, if you have and this is a statement I make to a lot of people, M&A is stress test on everything you do. If you do it well, you'll probably do it with less pain. But if you do it poorly, you're going to be in a truckload of pain. And if you don't have a strong sense of culture, vision, values inside your organization that you and across your leadership and people really bond to, then that's going to be harder to then tell people, okay, well, we got this better thing going on over here. Come and join this. Culture to me means, do you guys have a set of values that you adhere to, that is prominent and that is distilled within your organization? And here's a good story. Just when we acquired ExactTarget, the state of Illinois put in a ban for, and I'm going to get this wrong. I think it was like the bathroom ban, or anyway, it was in the realm of LGBTQ. And Mark and our leadership team said, hell no, we are not going to support this. This is not what we stand for. We believe in equality. We believe in these rights, and we are not. And, maybe we can look up some articles, but I think it went in as so far as, we will take out our office if this continues. And we were strong in our voice and our opinion about that matter. And I think not every company does that. But I personally was very proud of that. I personally felt great that we were standing up to something that we have talked about, that is instilled in our values, and that we were going to put money, to what we were saying.
To circle back to the story about the orange branding acquisition, what ended up happening with that? I would imagine that they didn't get to keep their branding. That's how I think that.
No, they didn't get to keep their branding. But this is about timing. Why can't I keep my branding right now for the next 6 months, 8 months, a year? Why do I have to rip and remove right away when everything else was so raw? So keeping that. Also, co-branding together, put a little blue, put a little orange, put it on a mug, put it on a t-shirt, whatever that meant, to start showcasing that we are now a blended family mattered to people.
Mm.
That doesn't mean eventually you won't be the ExactTarget brand would go and you be, marketing cloud. But knowing that that was an emotional trough that people needed to work through over time, what is that going to cost you? It's not going to cost you anything. Okay. In those instances, have empathy and let it go. And then eventually, as people start to learn what benefits could come from being in a blended family, working in partnership, having access to X, Y, and Z, then you start to do different things together and you start to have new conversations together.
I mean, that's integration in the truest sense of the word.
Yeah.
It's integration isn't just like smashing two things together and thinking that the particles like have to connect with one another. It's building bridges. It's, meeting
Yes.
people where they are. It's helping them blend into, so that the two cultures can like really come together and become one through, shared value.
Exactly. And bring a little fun to it. So I'll give you my last story. So, as I mentioned, our framework was that we would absorb all finance policies, processes, and systems into Salesforce. We didn't have, it was a big business. We didn't have the level of staff that could actually absorb this business. And we just didn't, we had to rethink that. So we made the decision to say, okay, we're going to keep a lot of the staff in Indianapolis because we need them to support the growth. And now, but we've already gone out and said, some of you will be laid off. Now we're saying some of you will be kept. And now we're saying, okay, most of you will be kept. So a lot of that mixed messages doesn't bode well for a lot of people. So we went out and hosted a 2-day integration event for finance and ops. All right, we now know a lot about you. Why don't you now learn a lot about us? Now, I'm just going to tell you, not all this content is like super fun and exciting. So how do I keep engagement? How do I keep people involved and active? I hired a face painter and I had this woman in the room and I weaved all these questions inside the deck. And if you got the answer right, you pick someone to get their face painted. And if you got it wrong, you got to get your face painted. And at first it was just silly and people are like, what is happening here? By the end of the day, everyone, who wanted to get painted, who never even answered a question, got painted. It was just a way of building bonds and inroads with each other to learn about each other. And for me personally, it was a great way of ingratiating myself because, we gave mixed messages and now I needed to be honest and open and I needed to help them come on board and be successful. So I had to put myself out there. So, best $250 I ever spent of the company's money.
That's awesome. I love that story. Iris, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's been a real pleasure having you on. I've learned a lot. And thank you.
Thank you. You have a great day. Take care.
And to all the people out there, thanks for joining another episode of the SaaS Buyers Club. Today, my guest was Iris Hu, former VP of M&A at Salesforce, conducted over 40 transactions, 18 years at Salesforce, shared some great stories. Her contact information will be in the show notes below, so you'll be able to reach out to her. Please do. If you are an acquirer and you're listening to this and you'd like someone who's a master at integration of acquisitions, she definitely is your person. As always, follow, like, subscribe, comment. Let us know who you'd like for us to interview on the show. See you next week.
Take care.